You are a newly trained pilot with only 200 hours of flight time. You are sitting in the co-pilot seat of a C47 Skytrain, idling at one end of the runway. You squint and can barely see the other end, just a scant mile and a half away. Then you throttle forward and begin your 6-hour trek over the deadly Himalayan mountains to a small Chinese airfield called Kunming. Many barriers faced the pilots and aircrews who flew the hump. They faced large mountains and bad weather. They faced Japanese fighters. They did all this to resupply the troops holding the Japanese army at bay. Their efforts led to the Allied victory, as well as technological advancements in aircraft. In order to secure more resources for their economically deprived island nation, the Japanese invaded mainland Asia in 1939. From then on, they had Chinese troops on the run. The only way to resupply these troops was from Burma, what is now called Myanmar, and India. Once the U.S. got involved in the war, the Army Corps of Engineers started work on the Burma Road, which was supposed to be the main method of resupplying the besieged troops. This turned out to be a bad idea, as the road wound through narrow mountain passes and was constantly being washed out by rain. This caused the army to turn to the air. The route would be a dangerous one over the southern end of the Himalayan mountains and through bad weather from small airfields. Between April 1942 and November 1945, these pilots flew thousands of tons of cargo across the Himalayan mountains and through devastating weather. This was needed to resupply the besieged Chinese and American troops holding the Japanese at bay. There were many natural barriers while flying the hump. The height of the mountain as well as the weather proved deadly. December and January contained high winds with a strong fear of icing with minimal storms due to the freezing temperatures. February through April contained the worst flying weather possible. It's a combination of the worst of winter and the monsoon. May to September contained the harshest monsoon weather imaginable. Heavy rain, dense clouds, and lightning made flying the hardest thing these pilots would ever do. Through the aircrew's perseverance and dedication, they were able to help hold the Japanese at bay. October and November, while being the best weather in which to fly, the Japanese were in the skies prepared to attack the transports. However, those were not the only uncontrollable barriers. In the skies, the Japanese Air Force flew Mitsubishi A6M0s and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars to try and take out as many of the Air Transport Command's aircraft as possible. This limited the amount of cargo able to make it to the troops on the ground. The 23rd Fighter Group, formerly the Flying Tigers, assisted in escorting the U.S. transport in their P-40 Warhawks, P-38 Lightnings, and P-51 Mustangs. The fighters protected the transports when they could, but it was impossible for every transport to be escorted. This was due to weather conditions and because there were more flights than could be handled. In an act to confuse the Japanese, Air Transport Command flew several armed B-24s like transports. These shot down 8 Ki-43s. Pilots and engineers needed to overcome barriers of their own. Pilots were given minimal flight time of 200 hours before getting put into operational squadrons. The USAAF needed as many pilots as they could train as quickly as possible. This led them to limit the pilots' training, making the pilots severely underprepared. The aircraft the pilots were tasked with flying required constant improvement to be better suited to fly the hump.
They were moving right on to the bigger airplanes right away with minimum experience to what they have now. Mm-hmm. The C-47 is a very solid aircraft. It is very forgiving in a lot of ways, and they proved that in combat. The airplane has been overloaded by significant numbers and has stayed in the air, has taken battle damage and stayed in the air. It's an easy handling airplane. It's a solid performer, but it's also like driving a truck. It is, because it's of its size and the flight controls are not assisted, it's all Armstrong steering.
The Douglas C47 Skytrain was the first airplane operated over the hump. It started its service at the beginning of the war. It is an important aircraft that flies and handles well. The C-47 was operated all throughout the war in diminishing numbers due to aircraft that could carry more cargo. It was first flown by the Chinese National Aviation Corporation, CNAC, and other domestic airlines. When the U.S. joined the war, the Air Transport Command, ATC, was created to take over the operations. The consolidated C-87 Liberator Express was merely a modified B-24 introduced by the end of 1942. These modifications, however, were not small. All of the bombing equipment was removed. This included bomb racks, bomb sight, and bombardier equipment. In addition, the defensive armament was removed. The nose, waist, and tail turrets were covered, while the top turret was replaced by an Astrodome. 25 seats were added on the personnel transport variants. A 6-foot square door was added to the left side of the fuselage for loading purposes. Even though it could carry more cargo, it was extremely disliked by crews as they needed to overcome more barriers during their missions. This plane was heavy and incredibly difficult to fly. Gas leaks did occur in the fuselage. Taking off in this plane was difficult as a bomber, which means it was even harder in its modified state. Since this bomber was intended to land on smooth runways with no load after dropping its bombs, landing this aircraft was a feat that was overcome daily. With the nose gear collapsing often, because it was overloaded, the C-87 was an even harder plane to land. The Curtiss C-46 Commando and Douglas C-54 Skymaster were brought in to finish the job. They were introduced to the China-Burma India theater around the same time in 1943. The C-46 could carry twice the amount of cargo than the C-47 while also being better suited for higher altitudes. Both of these planes did not handle as well as the C-47, and neither were exceptionally well liked. Thanks to the brave efforts of the pilots, 1.25 to 1.3 million Japanese forces were held up in the China-Burma India theater. This allowed the Americans to advance more easily through the island hopping campaign in the Pacific theater. Because of these operations, technological advances were made rapidly after the war and currently still being improved. A new development in technology, ADS-B, is a system that tells other aircraft your location. Just recently, as of January 1st, 2020, the FAA mandated all aircraft have this technology. This technology will hopefully decrease the amount of in-air collisions and improve traffic avoidance. New instruments are more accurate and more reliable. These new ones are glass cockpits that replaced the old instruments.
Very rudimentary by comparison. We have just recently modified this airplane with what we call an AHRS unit, Artificial Horizon Reference System. And it happens to be about 4 inches square and about 3/4 of an inch thick, electronic, and it gives us all that information and then some, where the old gyro was 10 to 15 pounds and was quite large and not very accurate.
Okay.
So in like modern airplanes, the Airbus, Boeing products, electronic flight displays, inertial reference systems, and even in the light training aircraft now with the G1000s, they've got AHRS units in them, solid state electronic units that airplane never had.
The most important advancement of all is the GPS. This allows anyone to see where they are thanks to the constant satellite connections. GPS allows someone to map their location and get directions to their destination. The hardships faced by all aircraft in World War II, especially in the China-Burma India theater, led to the massive advancements in aircraft technology. Due to the sacrifice of the air crews who flew the hump, the Allies were able to resupply the troops on the ground and hold the millions of Japanese troops in China. The losses from flying in weather with their technology caused new tech to be developed to reduce losses and make flying safer. We owe a lot to the dedicated air crews who flew the hump.